Annette sat in the staff bunk room on level 4, waiting for the mainframe to respond to the power-up and debating whether or not to initiate the P-Epsilon sequence. Once the failsafe system was triggered, all of the connecting corridor doors would unlock, and those doors that were electronically powered would open. The creatures that had been trapped these last days would be free to roam, and most of them would be hungry. She didn't want to run into any unpleasantness upon her departure, but as the first lines of code spilled across the screen, she decided against running the sequence. The P-Epsilon gas was an experiment anyway, something a couple of the microbiologist techs had worked up to appease the Umbrella damage control staff. If it worked, it would knock out the RE3s and all of the human carriers that had been affected by the initial airborne, the first wave, ensuring her a safer trip to the escape transport tunnel. But the spies were coming, and Annette didn't want to make things easy for them. She'd heard the lift being recalled as she'd stumbled her way to the synthesis lab, which was fine. Great. They'd be just in time for the finale, and she wanted them fighting for their lives as she sped away from the facility, away from the brilliant explosion that would consume the multi-billion-dollar facility. And it'll burn. It'll all burn, and I'll be free of this nightmare. End game. And I win. She felt good, awake and aware and in very little pain. She'd meant to go straight to the nearest computer outlet upon her return to activate the failsafe, even before collecting the sample. But she'd barely been able to see straight as she'd stumbled off the lift. She'd been afraid of forgetting something, or worse, of falling and being unable to get up again. A trip to the meds locker in the synthesis lab had fixed all that. Already the terrible pain was a distant memory, along with the bizarre, deluded thought processes that had made it so hard to concentrate. When her little cocktail shot wore off, she'd pay for the temporary reprieve. But for the next couple hours, at least, she was as good. She was better than new. Annette knew she was high, that she shouldn't overestimate her abilities. But why shouldn't she feel happy? She grinned at the small computer in front of her and started to tap in the codes, her fingers flying over the keys, feeling like her teeth would crack as the synthetic adrenaline pounded through her dilated veins. She'd made it back to the lab. William had come back. And the very last viable G-virus sample in the facility was tucked into her pocket. She'd hidden it in one of the fuse cases before she'd gone looking for William, and picked it up on the way to the staff room. 76E, 43L, 17A. Failsafe time, 20. Vocal warning power cut, 10. Personal authorization, Birkin. And that was it. Annette couldn't stop grinning, didn't want to stop as she lightly stroked the enter key, the triumph, a hot and liquid joy spinning through her numb and tattered flesh. One touch, and there was nothing on earth that could stop it. In 10 minutes, the taped warnings would start to run and the transport lift would shut down, cutting the facility off from the surface. In 15, the audio would begin the countdown. 5 minutes to reach the minimum safe distance by train. Another 5 and boom. 20 minutes before the explosion. More than enough time to get to the tunnel and power up the train, no matter what is loose. Enough time to speed away from the ticking dock beneath the city streets, through the isolated foothills at the outskirts of Raccoon. Enough time to get to the end of the track, walk out into the private plot of land, turn around and see Umbrella lose it all. As the clock ticked to 0, the plastique fail-safe charges in the laboratory's central power core would be activated. Even if all but one of the 12 explosive packets failed, that one blast would be enough to set off the secondary charges that were built into the walls themselves. Umbrella's fail-safe system had been designed to take it all down. The lab would become an inferno, blasting up into the dead city, visible for miles. And she'd be there to see it, to know that she'd done what she could to make things right. This is for you, William. The thought was bittersweet. For some time they hadn't enjoyed their relationship as husband and wife. William was so brilliant, so devoted to the work that the pleasures of synthesis and development had taken the place of the perks of married life. She had come to recognize his genius, to learn the joy of supporting him without the nuisances of relationship struggles. But now, her finger resting on the end of it all, she found herself suddenly wishing very much that there had been more between them in the last few years, more than her adoration for his incredible gifts, his appreciation of her assistance. This is our last kiss, my love. This is my contribution to the work, my final loving act for what we shared. Yes, that was right. That was the feeling. Annette pressed the key, her heart singing, and saw the locked code flash across the monitor in glowing green. I respectfully tender my resignation, she said softly, and started to laugh. The dock slid past the moving platform. Metal darkness bathed in murky orange light, and whatever had punched through the wall of the transport was gone. Leon had edged his way around the enclosed room twice and seen nothing at all, heard nothing but the smooth hum of the working motors. When the creature finally howled from the shadows atop the roof and Leon snapped the shotgun up, what he saw actually made him freeze. And the second it took him to really see it, his vengeful fury blew away like so much dust, replaced by an absolute bone-chilling awe. Holy shit. The thing was still shrieking, its head thrown back, the brutal gurgling scream like the voice of hell in the moving dock. It had been a man once. Arms and legs, shreds of clothing still hanging from its hulking body. But everything human about it had changed, was still changing as it bellowed its rage into the cold black. and Leon could only stare. Its body was swollen and rippling with strange muscles, the bare chest puffed and bloated with its endless scream. Its right arm was 6 inches longer than the left, the stained bone claws jutting from the pulsing hand. The bulbous moving tumor on its right bicep looked like nothing so much as an eyeball the size of a dinner plate, jerking wetly from side to side as if searching. And the scream was changing too, getting deeper, rougher, the shaggy face falling forward and melting into its chest. Like hot wax. Like a movie effect, the creature's head flowed into its upper body, disappearing smoothly into the inflamed and greedy skin. And at the same time, another face was forming, growing, rising up from the back of its neck with a horrible snapping sound like fingers being broken. Slitted eyes cracked open, a bony red hole of a mouth forming, taking up the furious cry with a new voice. And Leon squeezed the trigger in denial, a denial of the monster's unholy existence. The shot hit its chest, and a thick purplish blood sprayed out, cutting off the creature's scream. But that was all it did. The monster's new face angled towards Leon, the domed head tilting, and it hopped down onto the platform, landing in a half-crouch on legs as big around as Leon's chest. It took one jumping, crooked step forward and was close enough for Leon to smell the strange chemical musk that poured from its glistening skin and see that the wound on its chest had stopped bleeding, that the strange flesh was eating the tiny holes. The creature raised its mighty claw, and Leon stumbled backwards, pumping another round and firing as the talons came down and sparks flew up from the metal rail as the shot blasted into the creature's stomach, more purplish fluid splattering from its body. The almost point-blank range of the heavy round barely fazed the towering monster. It took another step, and Leon backed away, pumping another round. And he tripped on the steps that led up to the transport room. Tripped and fell on his ass, the round going high over the creature's bullet-shaped head. One more step, and it would be on him. I'm dead. Except it didn't take the step. Instead, it turned towards the railing, its bizarre head tilting, the pits of its rudimentary nostrils flaring. And silently, almost gracefully, it leapt over the edge of the platform, out into the passing darkness. For a moment, Leon didn't move. He couldn't. He was too busy trying to understand that the monster hadn't killed him. It had smelled or sensed something. It had broken off the attack that it most certainly would have won and had jumped off the moving transport. I'm not dead. It's gone, and I'm not dead. Why, he didn't know, and couldn't begin to guess. Accepting that he was alive was enough, and a short time later, maybe no more than a few seconds, his knotted thoughts and senses told him that the transport was slowing down, that the shaft was getting lighter, the blackness washing to gray. Leon crawled to his feet and went to check on Ada. Sherry had heard the monster from far away, from somewhere deep in the giant hole, and felt even more scared than she had when the giant, Mr. X, Claire called him, had come into the train station. Claire had said it probably wasn't even the monster, that it was most likely some machine problem. But Sherry wasn't convinced. The sound was so distant and strange that it could have been something else. But what if it isn't? What if Claire's wrong? They stood outside a warehouse in the chill of the dark, stood over the big hole in the ground and waited for the mechanical noises to stop. The almost full moon was low in the sky, and Sherry could tell by the deep blue light of the horizon that it was very early in the morning. She didn't feel tired, though. She felt scared and anxious, and even with Claire holding her hand, she didn't want to go down into the black hole where the monster could be. After what seemed like a long time, the humming noise of the machinery stopped, and Claire stepped back from the hole. "The transport shaft," she said, and turned back toward the warehouse. "Let's go see if we can recall the..." "Sherry?" Sherry hadn't moved to follow her. She stared down into the hole, holding her charm and wishing that she was brave like Claire. But she wasn't. She knew she wasn't. And she didn't want to go down into the dark. I can't go down there. I'm not like Claire, and I don't care if that's where my mom went. I don't care at all." Sherry felt warmth across her back and looked up, startled to see that Claire had taken off her vest and was slipping it over her shoulders. "I want you to have this," Claire said, and in spite of her fear, Sherry felt a sudden rush of confused happiness. "But why? It's yours, and you'll get cold." Claire ignored her for a minute, helping her put it on. It was too big for her, and it had some dirt on it. But it was the coolest thing Sherry thought she'd ever worn. "For me. She wants me to have it." Claire knelt in front of her, now wearing only a thin black t-shirt and shorts. She looked at her very seriously, pulling the vest closed over Sherry's chest. "I want you to have it, because I can tell that you're scared," she said firmly. "And I've had it for a long time, and when I wear it, I feel like I can kick ass, like nothing can stop me. My brother has a leather jacket with the same design on the back, and he kicks ass. But he got the idea from me." She smiled suddenly, a tired, warm smile that made Sherry forget about the monster, just for a minute. "So now it's yours, and every time you wear it, I want you to remember that I think you are the best 12-year-old who ever walked." Sherry smiled back, hugging the faded pink denim to her body. "And it's a bribe, huh?" Claire nodded without hesitation. "Yes, and it's a bribe. So what do you say?" Sighing, Sherry reached for her hand, and they walked back into the warehouse to find the controls for the elevator. Ada woke up as Leon set her gently on a creaking cot. Woke up with a pounding headache and a pain in her side. Her first thought was that she'd been shot, but as she opened her eyes and Leon's worried, pale face swam into focus, she remembered. He was going to kiss me, I think. And then... What happened? She asked. Leon reached down and brushed her hair off of her forehead, smiling a little. A monster happened. The same one that got Bertolucci, I think. It put its hand through the wall of the transport and knocked you over. You hit your head after it clawed you. Virus. Ada struggled to sit up, to look at the wound, but the headache knocked her back. She reached up and carefully touched the throbbing spot just over her left temple, wincing at the feel of the sticky lump. Hey, just stay put, Leon said. The wound isn't too bad, but you took a pretty serious knock. Ada closed her eyes, trying to collect herself. If she'd been infected, there wasn't anything she could do about it now, and really, what an irony that would be. If it was Birkin who'd stabbed her and he was still hot, she'd end up collecting a G-virus sample in an extremely personal way. Deep breath. Keep it together. You're not in the transport anymore. What does that tell you? Where are we? She asked, opening her eyes. Leon shook his head. I'm not sure. Like you said, it's an underground lab or factory of some kind. The transport is just outside. I brought you to the closest room. Ada turned her aching head enough to see the small windows over a cluttered counter looking out into the transport bay. Gotta be 4th level where the lift stops. The main synthesis lab was on the 5th level. Leon was staring down at her so sincerely, his bright blue gaze so achingly tender that just for a few seconds, Ada thought about aborting the mission. They could go down to the escape tunnel together. They could hop on the train and get out of the city. They could run away. Run far, far away. And then what? Call Trent and tell him that you'll offer a refund? Sure. Then maybe you can meet Leon's parents, get a ring, buy a little white house with a picket fence, have a couple of kids. You could take up crochet and rub his feet when he comes home from a hard day of busting drunks and making traffic stops. Happily ever after. Ada closed her eyes again, unable to look at him as she spoke. My head hurts pretty bad, Leon, and the tunnel I saw on that map, I don't know where it is exactly. I'll find it, he said softly. I'll find it, and then I'll come back for you. Don't worry about anything, okay? Be careful, she whispered, and then felt his soft lips graze her forehead, heard him stand up and move towards the door. Just stay here. I'll be back soon, he said, and the door opened and closed, and she was alone. He'll be okay. He'll get lost trying to find the tunnel. He'll come back, see that I'm gone, and take the lift back to the surface. I can find the sample and escape, and it will be over. Ada counted a minute and then sat up slowly, grimacing at the pounding in her skull. A bad knock indeed, but not a debilitating one. She could function. There was a noise outside, and Ada stood up, walking to one of the small windows. She knew the sound even before she looked, and felt her heart sink a little. The transport was heading up, probably recalled to the factory by an umbrella team. Which means I don't have a lot of time. And if they find him... No, Leon would be okay. He was a fighter. He had the sense to run from danger. He was strong and decent, and he didn't need to have someone like her in his life. She'd been crazy to consider it even for a moment. It was time to wrap things up, to do what she'd come to do, to remember who she was. A freelance agent, a woman with no qualms about stealing or killing to complete a job, a cool and efficient thief who could take pride in a career with no misses. Ada Wong always walked away with the goods, and it would take more than a few hours with one blue-eyed cop to make her forget it. Ada pulled the key cards and master from her pouch and opened the door, telling herself that she was doing the right thing and hopeful that in time she'd come to believe it. Annette had run into some trouble. The trip down to the cargo room hadn't been bad. She'd only run across one carrier, one of the first stages, and had blown a hole into his ashy, withered skull with the first shot. She'd passed under a sleeping RE-3, but it hadn't stirred from its ceiling bed, and it seemed that the other creatures still lurking in the facility's shadows hadn't yet figured out that they were free. Either that, or more of them had disintegrated into mush than she'd imagined. In any case, she'd be gone before she had to worry about it either way. In all, she made it to the cargo room hall in under 3 minutes, and had punched in the key code with a sense of grand accomplishment. The high from the shot was wearing off, but she was still feeling good, until the hatch to the cargo room refused to open. Annette had tapped the simple code in a second time, more carefully, and nothing. It was one of the only doors in all the facility that didn't open automatically on fail-safe triggering, but it shouldn't have been a problem. There was a verification disk in the slot beneath the controls, the disk that was always there in spite of Umbrella's insistence that only the section heads were supposed to have access. And of course, upon checking, she'd seen that it wasn't there, that it wasn't where it was supposed to be. Someone had taken it. Annette stood in front of the locked hatch in the empty hall and felt the first bright tendrils of panic reach into her mind, a hysteria that she couldn't allow to take hold. The lab's going to blow up, and I've wasted 4, almost 5 minutes now, and where's the goddamn disc? Easy. Take it easy. You're okay. It's okay. A gentle echo, a whisper of reason in the shining hall. She'd simply have to take the elevator from a different level. She had the master key. She had a weapon. She had time. Not as much, but enough. Breathing deeply, Annette started back toward the hall that led to the stairs, reminding herself that all was well and that it didn't really matter, that Umbrella was going to pay whether or not she made it out alive. She didn't want to die. She wasn't going to die. But the gleaming, blood-splattered corridors and once sterile labs were going to burn either way. So there was no need to panic. And as she turned right and moved quickly down the connecting hall, her footsteps loud and hollow in the silence, a ceiling panel crashed down in front of her. And an RE3, a liquor, dropped to the floor and screamed for her blood. Annette fired, but only hit its scrabbling shoulder as it darted forward, reaching out with one deformed claw to swipe at her. She felt a sharp red pain in her forearm and fired again, shocked and disbelieving. And the second one caught it in the throat, and it screamed, blood spraying from its torn neck, its trumpeting shriek a garbled and spitting cry as it lunged at her again. The third shot blew into the grey jelly of its brain, and it flopped to a spasming stop just inches from her trembling legs. Gasping as she realized how close she'd been, Annette looked down at her bleeding arm, at the thick scratches that had torn through her lab coat. And something gave. Something in her mind, her racing mind, her pounding heart, the blood in the liquor, William's liquor, dead on the floor in front of her. All these things whirled and danced, spinning into a circle that came together and focused into a single, stunningly simple thought. A thought that made sense of it all. It isn't theirs. It was so clear, so crystal clear. She couldn't run from pain because pain would find her wherever she ran. She had proof dripping down her arm. William had understood, but had lost himself before he could explain, before he could tell her what she really needed to do. She had to confront her attackers and make sure they understood that the G-virus wasn't theirs, because it didn't belong to them. But will they understand? Can they? Maybe, maybe not. But she was so overwhelmed by the profound simplicity of the truth, she knew that she had to try to make them see. The work was William's. It was his legacy. And now it was hers. She'd known that before, but now she knew it. A ray of light in her mind that made everything else trivial. Not theirs. Mine. She'd have to find them, tell them, and once they accepted the truth of it, they would have to leave her alone, and then, if there was still time, she could go her own way. But first, she needed another shot. Smiling, her eyes wide and starry, Annette stepped over the liquor and started for the stairs. Leon thought he heard shots. He was in some kind of a surgical bay, the first room at the end of the first passage that he'd taken after leaving Ada, and he looked up from the pile of crumpled papers he'd found listening, but the distant cracks didn't repeat, so he went back to his search. He rifled quickly through the pages, desperate to find anything besides the endless lists of numbers and letters beneath the umbrella letterhead. Come on, there must be something useful in all this. He wanted out.
He wanted to get Ada and get the hell out. The disemboweled corpse slumped in the corner was reason enough. But it was more than that. The very air of the room, of the hall outside the room, and he was willing to bet of every room in the facility, was just wrong. It stank like death, but worse. There was an atmosphere of something darker, something evil. They performed experiments here. They ran tests and God knows what else here. And they created a zombie plague. They created the monstrous demon that attacked Ada. They'd murdered an entire city. Whatever they meant to do, they were practicing evil. Evil on a grand scale. The transport had taken them into a secret umbrella facility, and it was a big one. From the numbers on the walls, he knew he was on the 4th floor, whatever that meant, and the catwalk he'd taken to get to the strange operating room, only one of 3 choices, had stretched over what had to be 60 or 70 feet of open space, the bottom to it lost in shadow. He didn't know how deep he and Ada had come, but he didn't really care. What he wanted was a map like the one she'd found in the sewers, a clear and simple diagram with an arrow pointing to out. And it ain't here. Frustrated, Leon pushed the useless papers aside and saw that there was a computer disk lying on the steel table that had been hidden beneath a stack of chemical readouts. He picked it up, frowning. For cargo room verification was printed on the label in smudged block letters. Sighing, Leon slipped it into his pocket and rubbed at his aching eyes with his right hand, his left arm basically useless again after carrying Ada from the lift. He didn't want to look for a computer to see what was on the disk. He didn't want to go wandering from room to room looking for the exit, seeing what atrocities Umbrella had played with before they'd shut themselves down. He was tired and in pain and worried about Ada. And he decided as he walked back to the door that he should go back and talk to her. He wanted to ease her mind, saying that he would find the way out, but the place was just too goddamn huge. If she even knew the direction or could remember the floor number. Leon opened the door, stepped into the hall, and a woman with a gun was standing in front of him, a 9mm pointed at his chest. She was bleeding, thin streams of crimson pouring from one arm and dripping down her dirty white lab coat, and the look on her face, the strange, wide-eyed, glassy look that played across her features, told him that making any sudden moves would be a very bad idea. Oh, Jesus, what is this? You murdered my husband, she said. You and your partner and the girl, too. All of you. You wanted to dance on his grave, but I have news for you. She was high on something. He could hear it in her high, trembling voice and see it by the way her skin twitched and ticked. He kept his hands at his side, kept his voice low and calm. Ma'am, I'm a police officer, and I'm here to help, okay? I don't want to hurt you. I just... The woman dipped her bloody hand into a pocket and held up something. A glass tube full of some purple fluid. She grinned widely, raising it over her head, the gun still trained on his chest. Here it is. It's what you want, isn't it? Listen to me. Do you hear me? It isn't yours. Do you understand what I'm saying? William made it, and I helped him, and it doesn't belong to you. Leon nodded, speaking slowly. It doesn't belong to me. You're right. It's yours. Absolutely. The woman wasn't even listening. You think you can take it, but I'll stop you. I'll keep you from taking it. There's plenty of time. Time for me to kill you and Ada and anyone else who tries to take it. What do you know about Ada? Leon barked, taking a half step towards the mad woman, no longer feeling so calm. Did you hurt her? Tell me. The woman laughed, a humorless, insane cackle. Umbrella sent her, you stupid shit. Ada Wong, Miss Love'em Leave'em herself. She seduced John to get the G-virus, but it's not hers either. It's not. It's not yours, it's mine. A massive shock rocked the floor, pitching Leon to the ground, a rumbling vibration that shook the walls. And pipes and plaster rained from the ceiling, a thick beam striking the woman down with a dull thump. Leon covered his head as bits of concrete and white chunks of drywall slapped at him. And it was over. Leon sat up, staring at the woman in shock, not sure what had happened. She wasn't moving. The metal beam that had struck her still hanging from the ceiling, one of her arms pinned beneath it. And a cool, clear voice suddenly blared from hidden speakers somewhere in the walls. Female, calm, and punctuated by the rhythmic bleat of a honking alarm. The self-destruct sequence has been activated. This auto-destruct sequence cannot be aborted. All personnel should evacuate immediately. The self-destruct sequence has been activated. This program cannot be aborted. All personnel should evacuate immediately. Leon scrambled to his feet, took one running step toward the fallen woman, then reached down and plucked the glass cylinder from her outstretched hand, shoving it into his utility pack. He didn't know who she was, but she was too crazy to be holding anything in a test tube. Ada. He had to get to Ada, and they had to get out. The throbbing, screeching alarms blasted through the echoing halls, chasing him through the door to the catwalk, along with the indifferent-sounding female's repeating message of imminent destruction. The recorded voice didn't say how long they had, but Leon felt quite certain he didn't want to be around when the clock ran out. The cool, dark ride down through the elevator shaft ended in a squeal of hydraulic brakes and then silence as the engine shut down and trapped them somewhere in the seemingly endless tunnel. Claire, what? Claire held a finger to her lips, hushing Sherry, and heard what sounded like an alarm from somewhere outside. A repeating muffled bleat of honking noise. There seemed to be talking, too, but Claire could only make out the faintest mumble. "Come on, sweetie. I think the ride's over. Let's see where we ended up, okay? And stay close." They moved out of the transport room and onto the platform, the distant sounds not so distant anymore, and there was light coming from somewhere behind the lift. Claire took Sherry's hand as they walked quickly around, not wanting to worry the girl, but feeling pretty sure that it was an alarm they were hearing. There was definitely someone speaking over the rhythmic squeals, too, and Claire wanted to know what they were saying. The lift had stopped only a few feet down from some kind of a service tunnel, the light she'd seen coming from a caged bulb that hung down from the tunnel's ceiling. There wasn't a door, but there was a decent-sized crawl space at the end of the short passage. It would have to do. It's either that or climb back to the surface, probably only a mile or so up. Not a chance. Claire boosted Sherry up and then climbed up after her, moving to the front and crouch-walking to the dark hole. The bleated sound got louder the closer she got to the crawl space, the mumble transforming into a woman's voice. She strained to hear the words, hoping that she'd catch elevator malfunction and temporary. But she couldn't make it out. They'd have to abandon the lift and hope that they were leaving it for something better. Claire swiveled around, sighing. "Looks like crawl time for me and 3, kiddo. I'll go first, and then..." Sherry shrieked as something landed on the roof of the transport behind them, crashing through the top in a thundering clap of rending metal. Claire grabbed her, pulling her close, her breath caught in her throat. And a hand. 2 hands appeared through the hole in the roof. 2 thick arms clad in shadow. And the gleaming white of Mr. X's enormous skull rose up from the destroyed lift, like a dead moon on a starless night. Claire turned and pushed Sherry towards the darkness of the crawl space, her heart hammering, her body suddenly slick with sweat. "Go! I'm right behind you!" Sherry disappeared into the curving black, darting out of sight like a frightened mouse, and Claire didn't look back, was too scared to look back as she followed Sherry into the hole, their relentless stalker surely coming through the shattered elevator to continue his determined and unfathomable hunt. Ada had heard pieces of Annette's screaming rant from the shadows of the catwalk hub where the 3 metal spans joined. She'd forced herself not to rush to Leon's aid, promising herself that if she heard shots, she'd reconsider. But then the laboratory facility had been violently shaken and the bland voice of the recording started its loop. Ada staggered to her feet, furious at the woman scientist, a part of her aching for Leon, knowing what this meant. Annette had triggered the failsafe, which meant they probably had less than 10 minutes to get the hell out of Dodge. And Leon doesn't know the way. Not important. If she was going to collect the sample, which Annette surely had on her, she needed to do it now. Leon wasn't her problem. He'd never been her problem. And she couldn't quit now, not after the hell she'd been through to get Trent's precious virus. Ada took a single step away from the main fuse panel that connected the 3 catwalks and heard the pounding footsteps coming towards her. Footsteps too heavy to be Annette's. She slid back into the shadows and around to the span that led west, pressing herself against the hub's frame. A second later, Leon went running past, probably back to where he thought she'd be waiting for him. Ada took a deep breath, blowing it out as she swept Leon from her mind and hurried across the southern bridge to find Annette. Ada was gone. Has been activated. This auto-destruct sequence... Shut up, shut up! Leon hissed, standing helplessly in the middle of the room, his stomach knotted, his hands balled into fists. When she'd heard the alarm, she must have panicked and run. She was probably stumbling through the giant facility, lost and dazed, maybe looking for him as that infernally calm voice repeated as the sirens blared and rang. The transporter lift. Leon turned and ran back through the door and saw that it was gone. A large empty hole a few feet deep where it had been. He'd been too intent on getting to Ada, he hadn't even noticed that it wasn't there anymore. We have to find that tunnel. We have to. Without the lift, we're trapped here. With a silent howl of frustration, Leon turned and ran back towards the catwalks, praying that he would find her before it was too late. The crawl space ended abruptly, stopping over at least a 7-foot drop to an empty tunnel. Her ears ringing, her mouth dry as dust, Sherry grabbed the edges of the square hole, closed her eyes, and jumped. She swung out over the hall and let go as soon as she was straight up and down, landing crooked and falling as her right leg crumpled. It hurt, but she hardly felt it, scrambling on hands and knees to get out of the way, staring up at the hole. And there was Claire, her head coming out, her wide, worried eyes taking in that she was okay, that the hall was empty and safe. Except that there were bells ringing and a woman on an intercom was talking and Mr. X was coming. Claire stretched her arm down as far as she could with the gun. "Sherry, I need you to hold this. I can't turn around." Sherry stood and reached up, grabbing the barrel, amazed at how heavy the gun was as Claire let go. "Don't point it at anything," Claire breathed, and then she actually dove out of the hole, curling her body and landing on her shoulder, her head tucked in tight. She did a half somersault, and then her legs banged into the concrete wall. Before Sherry could even ask if she was all right, Claire was on her feet, taking the gun and pointing to the door at the end of the hall. "Run!" she said, and started to run herself, one hand pushing on Sherry's back as they sprinted for the door as the intercom voice told them to get out, told them that a self-destruct sequence had been activated. And behind them, a sound of crashing metal tore through the blaring noise of the sirens, and Sherry ran faster, terrified. Annette Birkin crawled out from beneath the crushing weight of the cold metal, still holding the gun. The G-virus gone. As she opened her mouth to scream her fury, to rail to the gods at the injustice of her terrible plight, blood dribbled out across her lips in a thick streamer of clotted drool. Somehow, she made it to her feet. Ada told herself that she didn't deserve Leon Kennedy's good opinion anyway. She'd never deserved it. Forgive me. As he ran back across the catwalk from the Transport Bay area and swung west, running blind with fear for her, she stepped out of the hub shadows and pointed the Beretta at his back. Leon. He spun around, and Ada felt her throat lock at the relief that spread across his face and struggled not to feel anything more as the joy turned sour, his grin fading. Please forgive me. I've been waiting for you, she said, and felt no pride at how smooth and steady her voice sounded. How very cold. The alarms blared, the mechanical voice almost as icy as hers, telling them that the failsafe couldn't be shut down. She didn't have time to let him get used to the idea that she was as much a monster as the Birkin thing or one of the soulless zombies. The G-virus, she said. Give it to me. Leon didn't move. She was telling the truth, he said. No anger, but more pain than Ada wanted to hear. You work for Umbrella. Ada shook her head. No. Who I work for is no concern of yours. For the first time in years, since she'd been a very young girl, Ada felt the sting of tears, and suddenly she hated him for that, for making her hate herself. I tried, she wailed, her composure blown by the fierce torrent of anger that coursed through her. I tried to leave you back in the facility, and you had to take it from Birkin, didn't you? You couldn't just leave it alone. She saw pity on his face and felt the fury pass, swept away on a wave of sorrow for what she'd lost with him, for the part of herself she'd lost a long time ago. She wanted to tell him about Trent, about the missions in Europe and Japan, about how she'd become what she was, about every event in her miserable, successful life that had brought her to this place, holding a weapon on a man who'd saved her life. A man she might have cared about in a different time and place. The clock was ticking. Hand it over, she said. Don't make me kill you. Leon stared into her eyes and said simply, no. A second gone, then another. Ada lowered the Beretta. Leon steeled himself for the shot, for the bullet from Ada's gun that would kill him. And she slowly lowered the weapon, her shoulders sagging, a tear running down one porcelain cheek. Leon blew out his held breath, feeling too many things, a jumble of sadness and betrayal and pity for the tortured struggle in her beautiful dark gaze, and a shot rang out from the shadows behind her. Ada's eyes went wide, her mouth falling open as she pitched forward, the gun hitting the floor, her body hitting the rail and flipping over. Ada, no! He ran and dove, and somehow she caught the rail as he grabbed her wrist, her body dangling over the bottomless dark, blood spouting from her hanging, shattered shoulder. "Ada, hold on!" "Mine," Annette whispered. She raised the handgun again, intending to shoot the other, to take back what was hers, to make them all pay. And the gun was too heavy. It was falling, and she was falling with it. Together they fell to the dark metal, the dark spinning up into a mind and finally taking her pain away. "William." It was her very last thought before she went to sleep. The door opened into a room filled with screaming machines, the howls and hisses of the humming, rattling giants drowning out the shrill call of the alarm warning. Claire ran, pulling and pushing Sherry along, looking desperately for a way out, knowing that the monster was close. What does he want? Why us? A platform in the corner, some 6 feet off the floor, a stack of crates pushed to one side just beneath it. "This way!" Claire screamed, and they ran past the rows of shuddering metal consoles, heat pouring from the machines as Claire pushed Sherry up and then climbed after her. At the end of the metal platform was a double metal hatch. They dashed for it, Claire not thinking of anything but how to get away, how to destroy a thing that had survived all that it had. The door was unlocked, and they ran on to another platform. The heat in the shadowy chamber was searing, terrible. And it was a dead end. Claire saw that before they'd taken a half-dozen running strides into the massive room. They were on the overseer's platform in a foundry, the boiling heat rising up from the heavy smelting vats below. She had 12 bullets, split between 2 guns. Claire stumbled to the edge of the platform, Sherry next to her, the electric orange of the molten metal bathing them in its fervid glow. Hot enough to burn anything. How? How do I make him jump? "Sherry, go over there." She pointed to the farthest corner of the platform, and Sherry shook her head, her small face trembling with fear. "Do it now!" Claire shouted, and with a cry of terror, Sherry ran, her locket banging against the open flaps of the denim vest. Not a locket. And Sherry screamed, and Claire turned, and Mr. X was coming. He walked into the chamber as stiff and huge and impossible as when she'd first seen him, the eerie orange light turning him into even more of a nightmare. Claire stood her ground, jamming Iron's gun into her shorts, the half-formed plan running through her frightened mind. It probably wouldn't work, but she had to try. He reaches for me. I jump over the railing. I grab on. He falls. Mr. X turned his blank gaze toward her as he took his floor-shaking, measured steps. The black bullet holes in his face and throat just pockets of shadow in the smooth, terrible pumpkin light. And he turned towards Sherry and raised his fists and started for her. "Hey! Hey, I'm here!" Claire screamed, and he didn't hear her, didn't see her. His entire monstrous being focused on the cowering, sobbing girl huddled against the far wall, clutching her locket. and Claire knew what he wanted. The half-remembered phrases from both Sherry and Annette came together in a flash of awareness, forming the answer. G-Virus. Rip her apart. Good luck charm. Not a locket. Sherry! He wants the necklace. Throw it to me. If she was wrong, they were both dead. Mr. X closed in on the girl, blocking her from Claire's view. And the pennant, the G-Virus pennant that Annette Birkin had inflicted on her young daughter, came flying through the heated dark, hitting the floor in front of Claire's feet. Mr. X reeled around, following the path of the thrown pendant with his black eyes, forgetting Sherry the second the necklace left her grasp. It was true. Claire scooped it up, waving it at the monster, feeling a rush of incredible anger and malicious glee as the bloated giant started toward her with unwavering intent. Fists raising again, his lifeless features fixed on the glittering pendant. You want this? Claire taunted, the words spilling out of the fury for the wasted bullets, for the fear that she and Sherry had suffered. Yeah? Then come get it, you miserable, mindless bastard. The monster was less than 5 feet away when Claire turned and threw it into the bubbling, burning hot pool, the necklace disappearing into the melted iron. And the Superman creature that had terrorized them throughout the endless night walked straight into the rail, the metal bars snapping in his all-powerful wake, and plunged silently into the giant vat, a great wave of sizzling metal sloshing over the blackened sides, spontaneous eruptions of flame dancing up from the dark shape of his body as he disappeared beneath the surface of the molten lake. Triumph, sweet and wonderful. And then the cool voice of the recording changed suddenly, wiping away the joy of seeing Mr. X take a lava bath. Over the shrill blast of the mechanical sirens Claire heard, "There are 5 minutes to reach minimum safe distance. All remaining personnel should evacuate immediately. Please report to the bottom platform. Repeat. Please report to the bottom platform. Repeat." Sherry was at her side, and Claire grabbed her hand, and they ran. The pain was incredible, and Ada closed her eyes, wondering if she would die from it. "Ada, hang on. Just hang on, I'll pull you up." Through the throbbing, pounding sirens that assaulted her ears, Ada heard the countdown for the failsafe start to run. 5 minutes. He tries to save me, and we both die. Leon's grip was strong, the determination in his panicked, pleading voice almost as strong as her own will. Almost. But not quite. Ada turned her face up to his, saw that, in spite of it all, he still wanted her to survive. He wanted to help her up and carry her away to the safety of escape. Not this time. Not for me. Her life had been about selfishness, about ego and greed. She'd seen a lot of good people die, and somewhere along the way she'd lost the ability to care, telling herself that even the effort was a waste of time and a sign of weakness. And I was wrong. I was selfish and wrong, and now it's too late. Not too late. Whatever waited beneath her, the decision was made. Leon, go down, west, and find the cargo room, past the row of plastic chairs. You'll need the disc. It's in my pouch. Ada, I have it. Cargo disc, right? I have it, I found it. Don't talk, just hold on, let me help you. He fumbled at the rail, trying to maintain his grip. Talking was a horrible effort, but she had to finish, had to tell him before time ran out. The code is 345. Get to the elevator, Leon. Take it down. The subway tunnel leads out. Have to run full throttle. And watch out for Birkin, the G-carrier. He's changing by now. Leon nodded, his blazing blue eyes filling her up. Live, she said. And it was as good a word as any to go out on. She was tired, and the mission was wrapped, and Leon would live. She let go of the railing, and Leon screamed her name, and the sound of it followed her down into the dark like a bittersweet goodbye. Sherry was scared, but Mr. X was dead, and he must have been the monster all along. Not the one at the station, but the real monster, the one that had wanted to rip her apart all along. But she didn't have time to think about it as Claire sprinted, jerking her along back the way they'd come, through the mechanical room, through the hall with the crawl space, and around a corner. And Sherry screamed as a zombie reeled toward them, a dead white creature made of dusty bone, and Claire raised her gun and shot. And the dry white head caved in. The moaning dead creature crumpled to the floor, and then Claire was dragging her over the body and running for the door at the end of the hall. It was an elevator, and Sherry collapsed against one wall after Claire pulled her inside, trying to catch her breath as Claire punched the controls. After the speed of their run from Mr. X, the elevator's descent was a crawl. A soft, humming crawl. We're going to make it, Claire gasped. Just a little longer. Sherry nodded, her heart pounding even harder as the intercom voice told them they had 4 minutes left to be safe. Leon felt like he didn't know how to stand up and walk away. The image of her composed, beautiful face in the seconds before she'd let go. She's gone. Ada's dead. He reached for the Beretta, fresh grief washing over him as he picked it up, the weapon still warm from her touch. And it was too light. Too light by half because it wasn't loaded. There wasn't even a clip. She'd never meant to hurt him. She'd lied. She'd lied all along. But she'd never meant to hurt him. Our 4 minutes to reach minimum safe distance. All remaining personnel should evacuate immediately. Please report to the bottom platform. 4 minutes. He had 4 minutes to get far enough away to fulfill Ada's last request. He stood up and turned for the door and stopped, reaching into his pocket, pulling out the tiny glass tube full of purple fluid. He knew he didn't have time to spare, but it only took a second to pull his arm back and throw the sample as hard as he could, wanting it as far away from him as possible. If the laboratory responsible for so much death was going to burn, let the G-virus burn with it.
The elevator door opened and there was a train. A secret subway train in shining silver. It was silent and dark, not the powered-up thrumming machine that Claire had hoped to see, but it was still the most beautiful escape vehicle that she'd ever laid eyes on. With Sherry holding on to her arm, they ran to the door at the front of the three-car subway, the bleating alarm still sounding, echoing through the concrete tunnel. The woman's bland voice, the voice that Claire had started to hate, informed them that they had 3 minutes to get to minimum safe distance. They hurried aboard, Claire noticing and not caring that there weren't any seats, just a wide empty space for the passengers to stand in. The control booth was to the left. "Let's get this show on the road," Claire said, and the brilliant and radiant look of hope on Sherry's dirty, tired face made Claire's heart break, just a little. Claire looked quickly away, hopping up the steps to the control room, making a silent promise to herself that if the train didn't work, she'd carry Sherry through the tunnel herself, whatever it took to see that the fragile hope in her eyes wasn't broken. The code in the verification disk he'd found in the operating room opened the door just as Ada had said, the broad hatch opening into a short hall. With 3 minutes left, Leon dashed down the cold corridor through another over-wide door, a biohazard symbol emblazoned across the front, and found himself in the cargo room. He didn't have time to stop and get a good look, his focus on getting to the elevator before the recording told him he couldn't possibly get out of the facility alive. Leon ran to the back of the wide, strangely red-tinted room, found the controls for the large warehouse-type elevator, and slapped the button for down, ready to jump in and go. And nothing happened, except that a row of tiny lights, perhaps 20 tiny lights over the elevator door, started to flash in descending order, slowly. Leon reached forward and slapped the button again, feeling something like numb disbelief as the elevator crept down, pausing for what seemed like minutes between floors as the alarms blared and the countdown to the lab's destruction ticked closer and closer to the end. He turned around, feeling like he'd scream if he had to wait much longer. And for the first time, he got a clear look at the room he was in. The 2 tall, wide shelves that ran the length of the chamber had a very specific kind of cargo, and although the half-dozen giant glass containers that lined each shelf had nothing but clear red fluid, Leon felt a chill just looking at them. Each cylinder was large enough to hold a full-grown man, and it made him wonder what they had been built for. Doesn't matter. They're going to be blown to shit in a matter of minutes, and so am I if this goddamn thing doesn't hurry up. He turned back to the elevator, almost glad to be angry, to have something to feel besides loss. And the ceiling over the elevator started to shake and rattle. Leon backed away, pointing his magnum at the solid metal ceiling panel as it crashed down. And the monster from the transport lift landed in front of him.
The same demonic creature that had hurt Ada, that should have killed him. Birkin? And from the way it threw back its strange head and howled, the vicious feral sound drowning out the buzz of the alarms, he could tell it had come to finish the job. The subway was ready. It was powered up and ready to go, except it seemed that the tunnel gate release had malfunctioned. A console full of green lights and a single red dot that insisted the gate needed to be opened manually. 2 minutes to safe minimum distance. Won't make it. We'll never make it. Stay here, Claire said, and went outside to find the release, praying that it was nothing. Leon turned and ran as the monster started walking toward him, each powerful stride thundering through the chamber, the echoes of its terrible shriek still spinning through the room. The powerful shotgun hadn't been enough. He had to hit it someplace vulnerable. The eyes. Use the magnum. Leon was back at the door. He spun and fired, aiming the magnum at the creature's face. Except that the face was changing again, the jaw dropping, falling away as it screamed. Great jagged spikes of tooth or claw slid out from what was left of the mouth, from out of the top of its pulsating chest, and as another scream burst out of its mutating throat, Leon saw 2 new arms unfurl from its sides. The limbs snapped into place, elbows locking, thick worms of taloned fingers growing from its tips. The shots grouped tight, blowing into the thin stretched skin over its slitted left eye. The monster roared, this time in pain, and Leon saw shards of bone and pus-purple fluid splatter out, a small stream of dark blood obscuring the yellow ball of its eye. It shook its head back and forth, flinging more liquid. Squatting down on its haunches like a mutant frog, it leapt into the air, springing up and right, landing on one of the 7-foot-high shelves with an animal grunt. He couldn't see its eyes, couldn't see anything but its back as it slumped down, but it was changing again. He could hear the wet, snapping sounds and see the knobs of spine rising up through the purple flesh of its back. He didn't want to see what it was becoming, but the elevator hadn't landed yet, and he had 2 goddamn minutes. Leon grabbed another clip and slapped it home, then fired at what he could see. A shape with 6 legs. A shape that no longer looked like anything human. The shot hit one of its muscular shoulders, and the creature jumped. Like some wild, spidering beast, it leapt back to the floor, landing a few feet in front of him. Its chest had become a wall of strange teeth or spikes that opened and closed as it panted. And when it screamed again, the sound was a demon cry, like nothing he'd ever heard, like the dying screams of 1,000 damned souls. Leon got 2 shots off into the cluster of moving teeth and stumbled away, and beneath the constant blare of the sirens, he heard the bright and cheery ping of the elevator's arrival. Claire ran to the front of the train, looking at the series of levers and switches set into the tunnel wall, finding the red and white handle in less than 10 seconds and slamming it down. She heard the grating of metal somewhere in front of the train and turned to run back to the door. When she heard metal again, the ripping, tearing sounds of steel being bent and hammered out of shape, coming from somewhere behind the subway, from somewhere in the back of the tunnel. No way. She stared toward the back of the train, past the metal bars of a closed gate that led back into shadows, and heard a sound like bone on concrete, a grinding, heavy noise that repeated. Footsteps. Claire ran for the door, knowing that it couldn't be X. Absolutely could not. He was melted, gone, and they didn't have the G-virus anymore. And she caught a glimpse of movement past the bars of shadow some 30 feet away. A glimpse of something tall, wisps of smoke curling through the darkness, and the bitter, choking stench of something burned. It stepped out of shadow, stepped toward the back of the train car, raising charred, massive fists. Claire realized it was Mr. X, or what was left of him, and that he was surely a demon straight from hell. She'd combined the clips on their elevator ride. 11 rounds left. There was no way it would be enough, but it was all they had. Claire raised Ian's gun, wondering if this was the end. Leon ran around the shelf to his right, heading back for the elevator, and there were galloping, thundering footsteps right behind. Another turn, back through the middle of the room, and he was hit in the back, propelled forward and down as the beast rammed him, hot, rubbery flesh slamming him onto the floor. Leon rolled, and it was on top of him, its dripping teeth poised to drive through his skull, its thick legs pinning him down. The tumor, like an eye, was still there, opening out of the shoulder, looking at him, and he jammed the barrel of the weapon against its grueling chin and pulled the trigger, screaming, emptying the heavy rounds into its thrashing head. The beast shrieked, flailing, falling sideways off Leon. In a flash, he was up and running, straight for the open elevator. The enormous, freakish animal was still howling as Leon sprinted into the lift and turned, hitting the control marked down. And saw the beast shuddering, changing, screaming and spitting chunks of bone and flesh and blood as it also turned and started for the elevator. It picked up speed with each staggering step, the door closing slowly, the terrible creature almost flying now. And Leon had the shotgun in his hands, pumped a shot and squeezed. The blast hit its barrel chest, knocking it back. And the door closed. Leon was going down, and there was only 1 minute left. With a loud crash, Sherry felt the train rock violently all around her. She ran to the door, remembering that Claire said not to leave and not caring. She didn't know what it was or what she could do to help, but she couldn't just stand there. And the car shifted again, another loud, banging crash blasting through the stale air, the floor trembling beneath her feet. Sherry reached the door and hit the open switch, her heart hammering, sweat dribbling through the dirt on her face. The door slid open, and there was Claire, pointing her gun at something Sherry couldn't see, something at the back of the car. Claire's gaze flickered to her, and her shouted words quaked with fear and panic. "Don't come out! Shut the door!" Sherry reached for the controls and hesitated, terrified for Claire, wanting to see what it was. And she darted her head out, just for a second, searching for the source of Claire's fear for whatever was slamming into the train car. A smell like chemicals and burnt meat had filled the dimly lit platform coming from... Sherry screamed when she saw it, when she saw the tattered, charred monster that was rocking the subway just past a wall of metal bars. She saw its giant fist pound the steel wall of the train, but it was the monster's face that she couldn't look away from. Mr. X. The skin was burned away from his face, from his whole body. Smoke drifted up from the blackened, melted lump of his skull, but the eyes were still alive, red and black and steaming with acrid smoke, but still very much alive. "Sherry, do it now!" Claire screamed, not taking her gaze from the smoking monster, from its terrible giant body coated with red metallic muscle, as red and burnt as its awful eyes. Sherry hit the controls, the door closing as Claire started to fire. The elevator did go down, though not as Leon had expected, and not nearly as fast as he needed it to go. The wide platform slipped down an angled tunnel like a slide, neon gridwork on black walls humming past, slowly. Now 40 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. "Go, go, go," Leon breathed, every ache and pain in his body forgotten to the rising dread that beat at his brain. The voice had stopped telling him to report to the bottom platform, now only making announcements in 10-second increments. As much as he loathed the repeated instructions, it was much worse not hearing them. The silences between the statements were telling him not to bother trying. To make it this far and then die because of a slow elevator. He couldn't accept that. He'd been through too much. The car crash, Claire, the running, and the monsters, and Ada and Birkin. He had to make it, or it was all for nothing. There didn't seem to be a real floor beneath the descending platform, or he would have tried it on foot. But the lift seemed to be lowering by grooves cut into either side of the darkness by some mechanism that he couldn't begin to guess at. 20 seconds to reach. Leon started to shake, the tension running through his muscles, tightening them, making it hard to breathe. What was safe distance? When that cool, inhuman voice reached 0, how long before the explosion? Full throttle. She said full throttle. The train would have to be fast, and he had 10 seconds left to get to it as the strange elevator continued its smooth, unhurried trek into the dark. The door slid shut, and Sherry was safe. For the moment. Claire's thoughts had kicked into overdrive, spinning through her limited options in a flash. She knew she couldn't hope to injure the creature, but she might be able to distract it long enough for them to get away. She wished she'd bothered to show Sherry the simple controls for the train, wished that the train was already moving, taking Sherry to safety. The recorded message was counting down the final 10 seconds to reach a safe distance. As the smoking remains of Mr. X dealt another hammering blow to the dented subway wall, Claire aimed for its mutant head and fired. 5 shots, 4 of them smacking into the bizarre material that made up its flesh, about where a human's ear would be. The fifth went wide, and as the explosive thunder echoed through the shadows of the chill platform, the thing that she dubbed Mr. X turned slowly toward her. Now what? The recorded female voice distracted her for a split second as Mr. X took a single step toward her, a lumbering, monstrous step that pulled it out of the shadows. 3, 2, 1. Safe distance minimum now required. Self-destruct will occur in 5 minutes. There are now 5 minutes until detonation. The alarm still blared, but at least the voice had shut up. She wouldn't have noticed in any case, her wide-eyed gaze fixed on the creature. It was hideous, all the more so for its still humanoid shape, like a mockery of reality. In spite of the charred, smoking patches that covered most of its body, its unnatural flesh hadn't lost its elasticity. The reddish matter beneath the burns flexed and contracted like real muscle. It looked like a skin giant that had crawled from beneath a burning building. And if it had suffered from its molten metal bath, she couldn't see it. Another mighty step, and the arms rose, the barred gate was ripped down, the iron bars were crashing to the concrete. Slow, at least. At least there's still that. It was the only thing she had going for her. Claire sprinted for the subway door, still afraid, but the smoking monster was slow. Powerful, but unable to really move. And suddenly Mr. X wasn't just walking anymore. The creature bent at the waist, bent its knees and pushed off the ground in a dynamic lunge that tore gouges in the concrete, its deformed feet propelling it toward her at a full run. Claire didn't think. She dodged right and took off past the hunched, loping monster, running as fast as she could. It almost got her anyway, its reflexes faster than fast, as if losing its facade of skin had freed it somehow. As she leapt over the broken gate and into the shadows, she heard the screech of not-flesh fingers raking across the cement, saw that Mr. X had brought one of his mighty arms up, slashing through the air where she'd been only a second before. It meant to disembowel her. But why? No G-virus, no reason. Claire ran deeper into the echoing darkness as the intercom system calmly informed her that they had 4 minutes left. There are now 4 minutes until detonation. Shit. Just when he thought he might have a stroke from the frustration, the elevator finally stopped. Leon jerked at the handle to a thick metal door, tensing himself to run. And the door opened into one wall of a passage, a sterile concrete corridor lit by flickering overhead bars. And there were no signs telling him which way to go. He'd heard once that when faced with a choice, most people instinctively turned in the direction of their dominant hand. With the crappy luck he'd had throughout his long night in Raccoon, he decided to go the other way. Leon ran, his boots pounding the floor, wondering if he should even bother. Not far past the broken gate, Claire saw a walkway that crossed over the train, the stairs hidden by deep shadow. And she heard the pounding of Mr. X behind as it started after her, each running step a violent slap of mutant flesh against cement. The terror drove her on, her feet hardly touching the ground, not caring if she ran head-on into a wall in the deepening dark. Maybe that would be best. It was tremendously powerful. It was fast. It was impossible to kill. She didn't stand a chance if it caught her. And the steps were getting louder, faster. She heard the ripping scrape of its clawed fingers plowing up concrete. She had maybe a second before that hand tore into her. And she dodged right again, throwing herself into a well of darkness just past the stairs. Mr. X flew past, a mammoth hulking blur, and she actually felt the wind from his moving hand whisper against her leg as she hit the cold floor. Pain shot up her arm, her elbow cracking hard against the cement. She ignored it, jumping to her feet, searching for the monster in the dark. Her hand found an angled wall to the right, cement against her back and on the left. She was in the space beneath the stairs, and she had no idea where the impossibly silent X was. The shadows wouldn't help her if it could see in the dark. She ran her hands over the walls, found a switch, and punched it. The texture of shadow changed as dim light filtered down from somewhere above, and she saw the monster less than 50 feet away. Just as it turned, its thick red gaze scanning evenly across the deserted platform, and finding her, marking her. The only sound was a soft crackling coming from its still smoking flesh, until it took another step for the stairwell, and cement crunched beneath one leg. 6 or 7 shots left. Get the eyes? Claire stepped quickly out of the shadows and raised Iron's gun, squeezing the trigger backing towards the stairs. And X was positioning itself for another attack, the bullets smashing into its melted face, 2 of them ricocheting from the matter of its skull as it aligned to her position. She was at the stairs, sidling up a step, the rounds useless. Mr. X starting its lurching run. It would be on her before she could turn, before she could get up the steps. I'll die, but at least I'll hurt it first. Mr. X took 1, 2 powerful strides, halving the distance between them as Claire aimed, determined to make the last shots count. She fired, and the monster's left eye exploded, a burst of inky fluid splattering its wretched, inhuman face. Mr. X veered to its right, not stopping, but not coming straight at her anymore. It would still hit the base of the stairs. She had to try for the other eye, and she had about 2 seconds left. Claire aimed, found her mark, and click. There were no bullets left, and the monster was slamming into the base of the steps, the smell of roasted meat washing over her as it raised its giant hand up, and its giant, terrible body was all she could see. Claire rolled down the concrete stairs, hunching herself into a ball, and screamed as Mr. X's ragged clawed fingers raked across her left thigh, and a distant voice told her that they had 3 minutes left. He'd gone the wrong way. Twists and turns in the cold and empty halls had led him to a storage room. A dead end. There are now 3 minutes until detonation. Leon turned back the way he'd come, and with what felt like the very last of his strength, forced himself into a stumbling run. He was too exhausted to feel disappointed, to worry about his impending death, to wish that things were different. It took all of his energy just to keep moving. He'd make it or he wouldn't. Either way, he didn't think he'd be surprised. Claire hit the floor at the base of the stairs and leapt to her feet, blood running down her leg and a hot pulse of stinging pain. She staggered away. Nothing broken, but she knew her clawed leg was just the beginning of what it would do to her, a prelude to the real pain. Mr. X was still bent over the railing of the steps, but as she stumbled away, back toward the broken gate of the platform, the monster pushed itself off. It turned its immense body in her direction, the open blackness of its empty eye socket drooling out some dark and ichorous liquid. It would compensate for its altered senses, she was sure. It would compensate, realign, run at her again, and would slaughter her like the merciless machine it was. There was nothing she could do to stop it. Claire tripped on the metal bars of the gate, barely catching herself, blood pattering to the ground as she staggered another step. Please let it be quick. Here! Use this! Claire spun, saw that Mr. X was positioning itself for its killing strike, and saw the silhouette high above, on the walkway over the train. A woman's voice, a woman's shape, the shadowed figure throwing something that clattered across the concrete landing between her and Mr. X. It was metal. It was silver. She'd seen them in the movies. It was a machine gun, and Claire ran for it. Another final hope, another chance, however slim, that she and Sherry would survive. She reached the weapon, dropped, saw X pushing itself toward her, the thunder of its steps shaking the ground, and she scooped up the heavy gun, kicking against the floor and rolling onto her back, her shaking hand finding the trigger, her body moving to accommodate the weapon. Stock on the ground, arms twisted around the cold metal, aiming. The monster was only a step away when the spray of bullets crashed out of the gun. A clattering, rattling string of tiny explosions that shook Claire's entire body and whammed into the gut of the beast, the sheer force of so many rounds stopping it in mid-stride and pushing it back. She felt the vibrating metal trying to shake itself free of her grip, so she held it tighter, the butt of the weapon tapping against the floor at a manic pace. The bullets were still pounding into the creature's abdomen, so fast and so many that she couldn't hear her own gasping cries of fury and pain. And Mr. X was trying to move forward. But a strange thing was happening. A strange and beautiful thing. Its gut was being shredded by the endless stream of rounds, its midsection gaining depth and texture, black fluids coursing down its lower half from the ragged growing wound. X's mouth was open, an empty hole like its eye socket, and like the socket, thick liquid was pouring out, obscuring its pitiless face. Claire held on, directing the hail, watching the creature try to stand against the pulsing, crashing spray, watching it bleed, watching as it seemed to condense, its massive body crumpling, its torso sinking down. the bullet still flying, Mr. X raised its arms and split in two. Claire took a finger off the trigger as X's upper body toppled to the cement, a wet slap of heavy meat, and its legs collapsed, falling to one side, more strange blood gushing from both halves. Pools of shiny black grew around the massive pieces of its broken body, forming stinking puddles. The creature was dead, and even if it wasn't, it didn't matter anymore. Unless it could pull itself across the floor as fast as she could run, her battle with the terrible mystery that had been Mr. X was finally through. Claire was on her feet in a second, ignoring the squelch of blood in her boot and the pain that had caused it, her gaze searching the upper platform for her unknown savior. No one was there, and she didn't know if another minute had ticked by, the warning lost in the gunfire. "Hey!" Claire shouted, backing toward the subway car. "We have to go! Now!" No answer. No sound but the ringing in her ears and the echo of her trembling words. If she wanted to save Sherry, Claire turned and ran. 2 minutes until... Leon pushed himself to go faster, the twining tunnel a blur of gray that spun past his aching, breathless perception. He'd lost all track of the turns and twists of the corridor and was rapidly losing hope. A voice in the back of his mind telling him that maybe it would be best to stop, to sit and rest, and then he heard it. And that tiny, despairing whisper was obliterated by the sound of heavy machinery stirring to life, somewhere up ahead. Not far ahead. A train. Faster, legs distant, rubbery, lungs working, heart pounding. One way or another, it was almost over. Claire burst into the train, holding a giant rifle and with one leg covered in blood, barely pausing to hit the controls to the door before running for the engineer's booth. Sherry knew that they were in trouble, that it was going to be close, so she didn't waste time asking questions. She followed, relieved beyond measure that Claire was okay, but keeping it to herself. She's okay, and we're going now. A small, tinny version of the intercom voice and alarms blared out of the tiny room's control board. There are 2 minutes until detonation. Claire had dropped the oddly shaped rifle and was hitting buttons, throwing switches, her attention fixed on the console. A giant mechanical hum suddenly enveloped them, a growing, whining rumble that made Claire grit her teeth. Sherry couldn't tell if it was a smile, but she smiled as she felt the train lurch and start to move, taking them away from the platform. Claire turned, saw Sherry standing behind her, and tried to smile. Claire rested one hand on Sherry's shoulder, but didn't say anything. So Sherry didn't either, waiting to see what would happen. The train started to go faster, sliding past dimly lit halls and platforms, the tunnel in front of them dark and empty. Sherry let the warmth of Claire's hand remind her that they were friends, that whatever happened, Claire was her friend. And she saw a man, a policeman, stumble into view ahead on the left. And then the train was gliding past him, his eyes wide and searching and desperate in his dirty face. "Claire? I see him!" Claire turned and ran out of the booth, her footsteps clattering through the metal train car, sprinting to the door. She hit the control and the door slid open, the booming, grinding sounds of the subway billowing into the closed space. "Leon!" she screamed. "Hurry!" She jerked back suddenly, a wall sliding by, and spun around, looking as desperate as the man had. Another second, she turned back and closed the door. "Did he make it?" Sherry asked, realizing that Claire couldn't possibly know, even as the words came out of her mouth. Claire came to her and put an arm around her as the train kept going faster and her face knotted with worry. And the voice on the intercom told them they had 1 minute left. And the door in the back of the car opened. In stumbled Leon, his arm wrapped with a shredded, stained bandage, his hair matted with dark, dried goo, his eyes bright and blue in the... Claire burst into the train, holding a giant rifle with one leg covered in blood, barely pausing to hit the controls to the door before running for the engineer's booth. Sherry knew that they were in trouble, that it was going to be close, so she didn't waste time asking questions. She followed, relieved beyond measure that Claire was okay, but keeping it to herself. A small, tinny version of the intercom voice and alarms blared out of the tiny room's control board. "There are 2 minutes until detonation." Claire had dropped the oddly shaped rifle and was hitting buttons, throwing switches, her attention fixed on the console. A giant mechanical hum suddenly enveloped them, a growing, whining rumble that made Claire grit her teeth. Sherry couldn't tell if it was a smile, but she smiled as she felt the train lurch and start to move, taking them away from the platform. Claire turned, saw Sherry standing behind her, and tried to smile. She rested one hand on Sherry's shoulder, but didn't say anything. So Sherry didn't either, waiting to see what would happen. The train started to go faster, sliding past dimly lit halls and platforms, the tunnel in front of them dark and empty. Sherry let the warmth of Claire's hand remind her that they were friends, that whatever happened, Claire was her friend. And she saw a policeman, stumble into view ahead on the left. And then the train was gliding past him, his eyes wide and searching and desperate in his dirty face. Claire turned and ran out of the booth, her footsteps clattering through the metal train car, sprinting to the door. She hit the control and the door slid open, the booming, grinding sounds of the subway billowing into the closed space. "Leon!" she screamed. "Hurry!" She jerked back suddenly, a wall sliding by, and spun around looking as desperate as Leon had. After another second, she turned back and closed the door. "Did he make it?" Sherry asked, realizing that Claire couldn't possibly know even as the words came out of her mouth. Claire came to her and put an arm around her as the train kept going faster and her face knotted with worry. And the voice in the intercom told them they had 1 minute left. And the door in the back of the car opened. In stumbled Leon, his arm wrapped with a shredded, stained bandage, his hair matted with dark, dried goo, his eyes bright and blue in the mask of dirt. "Full throttle!" he shouted. Claire nodded, and Leon blew out a heavy breath. He staggered toward them, the train shifting back and forth, speeding now, rocketing through the tunnel. He put his arms around Claire, and Claire hugged him tightly. 30 seconds until detonation. 29. 28. The woman's voice kept counting down, the numbers seeming to come twice as fast as they should, and Sherry buried her face in Claire's warm side, thinking about her mum. Mum and Dad. She hoped that they'd gotten out, that they were safe somewhere. But they're probably not. They're probably dead. Sherry could hear Claire's heart pounding, and she hugged her friend tighter, thinking that she would think about it later. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Sequence complete. Detonation. For a second there was no sound at all. The alarms had finally stopped, and the clattering movement of the racing train was all there was to hear. And then there was an explosion, a muffled sound, a shoop sound that kept going, growing, becoming huge. Sherry closed her eyes, and the train rocked suddenly, horribly, and they were all thrown to the metal floor as bright burning light flickered through the window, as the sounds of a car crash blasted all around them, heavy thumps raining over the roof, and the train kept going. It kept going, and the light went away, and they weren't dead. The blinding flash dissipated, faded, and Leon felt the tension leaking out of his body. He rolled onto his side and saw Claire sitting up, reaching for the hand of the young girl next to her. "Okay?" Claire asked the girl, and the child nodded. Both of them turned to him, their faces expressing what he felt: shock, exhaustion, disbelief, hope. "Leon Kennedy, this is Sherry Birkin," Claire said, saying the words carefully, the slightest accent on Birkin. He got the message, even without the intensity of her gaze, nodding his understanding before smiling at the girl. "Sherry, this is Leon," Claire continued. "I met him when I had just gotten to Raccoon." Sherry returned his smile, a weary, too adult smile that seemed out of place. She was too young to smile like that. One more rotten deed to lay at Umbrella's door. Innocence stolen from a child. For a few seconds they just sat there on the floor, staring at one another, smiles fading all around. Leon hardly dared to hope that it was really over, that they were leaving the terror behind. Again he saw his feelings mirrored in front of him, in Sherry's worried brow and Claire's tired gray eyes. And when they heard the distant squeal of metal coming from somewhere at the back of the train, he didn't see any surprise. A rending, tearing screech followed by a heavy, somehow stealthy thump. And then nothing. "Should have known it isn't over." "Zombie?" Sherry whispered, the word almost lost in the gentle clattering sound of the speeding train. I don't know, sweetie, Claire said softly, and for the first time Leon noticed that her left leg was ripped to shit, blood oozing from several ragged scratches. He'd been too amazed at their narrow escape to see it before. How about I go take a look, Leon said, taking his cue from Claire, keeping his voice mild and even. No point in scaring Sherry any worse. He stood up, nodding towards Claire's leg. Sherry, why don't you stay here with Claire? Keep an eye on that leg. I'll see if I can find some bandages while I'm checking things out. Don't let her move, okay? Sherry nodded, her small face intent with purpose that again was too old for her years. I'll be back in a minute, he said, and turned toward the back of the swaying train, praying that it was nothing at all and knowing better as he reached for the Remington and went to see. Leon opened the door, the sounds of the rolling train amplified for a second before it closed behind him. Claire couldn't see him enter the next car from her position on the floor and wished she'd been in shape to go with him. If there was something else on the train, Sherry wasn't safe. None of them were. Don't think like that. It's nothing. It's over. Just like it was over with Mr. X. What should I do? Sherry asked, pulling Claire away from the disheartening thoughts. Direct pressure, right? Claire nodded. Yeah, except we're both pretty grimy, and I think it's starting to clot. Let's see if Leon comes back with something clean. She trailed off, her thoughts going back to Mr. X. There was something nagging at her, but she was a little dizzy from the blood she'd lost. G-virus. It wanted the G-virus before. Why had Mr. X come to the subway platform? Why had it been trying to get inside the train unless... Claire struggled to get up, fighting her swimming head and throbbing pain in her leg. Hey, don't move, Sherry said, a look of deep distress in her eyes. Leon said to stay still. She might have been able to overcome her physical problems, but seeing Sherry on the edge of panic was too much. If there was some G-virus creature on board, if that was why Mr. X had come, Leon would have to face it alone. She couldn't leave Sherry. If Leon didn't come back, she'd have to figure out how to detach their train car or stop the train so they could get off before the creature could get to them. Claire shut the thoughts off, forcing a smile to Sherry. Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to make sure he got through the second car. She could see the relief sweep across Sherry's face. Oh, well, forget it. I'm taking care of you now, and I say you stay still. Claire nodded absently, hoping that she was wrong, hoping that Leon would be back any second. The thunder of the Remington said different. Sherry grabbed her hand as two more shots blasted the hope from Claire's fuzzy mind as the train sped through the dark. The second car was clear, the same wide-open space that Leon had entered the train by, all dusty steel and not much else. Whoever had designed the escape vehicle had obviously figured the Umbrella employees would have to be packed in like sardines. Just us three, though, and our stowaway. There was nothing to see, but Leon moved slowly nonetheless, carefully scanning the shadowy corners and steeling himself for whatever was in the last car. Whatever it was, it couldn't be as bad as the thing that had jumped him in the cargo room. The Birkin thing, if that's what it was. The thought that the creature had anything at all to do with Claire's young friend was deeply unsettling, even obscene. A monster and a madwoman, both destroyed, both parents of the little girl. He reached the back of the dim and rocking train car and peered through the door, pushing all other thoughts aside as he tried to make out anything at all in the last car. Darkness and nothing else. Maybe there wasn't anything to see. But he had to look. He felt his heart start to pound fresh adrenaline through his body, felt his weariness fall away. Nothing. It was surely nothing. But it felt bad. Wrong. He took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping into the loud, whipping breeze of the outside, holding on to the rail. The rattle of the train drowned out the thumping of his heart as he moved to the last car, opened the door, and stepped into darkness. Immediately he raised the shotgun, all of his senses telling him to run as the door slid shut behind him. He reached back, slapping for a light switch. Darkness, but there was a powerful smell like bleach or chlorine, and there was the soft sound of wetness, of movement. A single bare bulb flickered on in the middle of the car as he found a button, and he thought for just a second that he'd lost his mind. A thing. A creature that wasn't even vaguely humanoid except for a strange pulsing tumor protruding from one side. A slick orb that looked very much like an eye. Birkin. The creature was a giant, stretching blob of dark, slimy matter spanning the width of the car. Leon couldn't tell how tall it was. The Birkin thing had thick streamers extended out, tentacles of wet and elastic goo attached to every part of the space in front of it. The ceiling, walls, and floor. And as Leon watched, the alien beast pulled itself forward, the dark limbs contracting, bringing the mass of the body a few feet ahead of where it had been. Not crazy. He was seeing it. Seeing the brackish moving colors of black and green and purple in its tentacles as it stretched out again, the viscous material latching to the metal of the car somehow, dragging the blob a few more feet ahead. The body itself was nothing so much as a gaping maw, a wet cave that still had teeth, and that would reach him pretty soon if he didn't snap out of his disgusted stupor. Leon aimed into the giant hole of its mouth and pulled the trigger, pumping in another round, firing, pumping, firing. And then the shotgun was empty, and the giant semi-liquid thing was still moving steadily forward. He didn't know how to kill it. didn't know if the rounds had even damaged it. His mind raced for an answer, for a solution that would end the terrible life of the G-virus monster. He could detach the last car, fire through the pins and chains that held it together, if he could find the locking mechanism. And it would still be alive, still living and changing in the blackness of the tunnel, becoming something new. The stretching elastic of its nebulous form inched forward, and Leon reached back for the door control. He'd have to try unhooking the cars. There was no other choice. Unless... He hesitated, then unholstered his magnum and pointed it at the impossible mass, at the strange tumor that peered out of a slit in its rubbery flesh, the eye that had been there in every form that Birkin had taken. Careful aim. The effect was immediate and total, the heavy round piercing the roomy sphere, and a hissing, screaming whine or whistle pouring out of the toothed maw like nothing on earth, like the howl of something mechanical and insane. The tendrils of unformed matter shrank inward, turning black, shriveling, and the thing imploded, pulling in on itself, withering into a steaming black mass less than a quarter its original size. Like a deflated beach ball, the gelded blob wrinkled and shrank, collapsing into a flattening thickness, drooling itself into a wide puddle of bubbling slime. "Suck on that," Leon said softly, the last bubbles popping, the pool a dead and inanimate thing. He watched it for a few moments, thinking about nothing at all, and finally turned to join the others, to tell them it was over. First day on the job, he thought. "I want a raise," Leon said to no one at all, and couldn't help the grin that broke across his face. A tired, sunny grin that faded quickly. But for the few seconds he wore it, Leon felt better than he had in a very long time. Leon was back and had found a jumpsuit that he tore into pieces and used to bind up Claire's leg. All he'd said was that they were safe now, although Sherry had seen him and Claire exchange a look, one of those "we shouldn't talk about it right now" looks. Sherry was too tired to take offense. She snuggled into Claire's arms, Claire stroking her hair, the three of them not talking. There was nothing to say, or at least not for a little while. They were alive, on a train thundering through the dark, and from somewhere not far ahead, a soft light came filtering in, coming through the window in the control booth, and Sherry thought it looked very much like morning. Epilogue. They saw the aftermath of the explosion from 10 miles outside the city, a black and billowing cloud that rose up into the early morning light and hung over Raccoon like a terrible storm or a bad dream, Rebecca thought. A reoccurring dream. An umbrella dream. She didn't say it aloud because it wasn't necessary. John and David hadn't gone through the Spencer estate nightmare, but they'd been at the Cove facility, witnesses to what Umbrella was capable of. Nobody spoke as David stepped up the speed, his knuckles white on the wheel. For once, John didn't crack any jokes about what might have happened. They all knew that it was bad. Before Jill, Chris, and Barry had left for Europe, Jill had wired them with her suspicions about another accident and asked them to keep tabs. When the phone lines had gone down, they'd loaded up the SUV and left Maine to see what could be done. The only question was, how many people had died this time? Maybe this is the end, finally. A blast like that, Umbrella can't cover this up so easily. Not if it's as bad as it looks. John finally broke the silence, his mellow voice uncharacteristically subdued. Failsafe? David sighed. Probably. And if there was a spill, we're not going in. We'll circle the city and then call for help from Latham. Umbrella is surely sending in its cleanup staff already. Rebecca nodded along with John. They weren't technically part of the Stars anymore, but David had been a captain before, and with good reason. They fell back into a tense silence, the dawn-touched trees spinning past the utility vehicle, Rebecca wondering what they would find. And then she saw the people, staggering up into the road, waving their arms. "Hey," she started, but David was already hitting the brakes, slowing down as they neared the threesome of ragged strangers. A cop with a bandaged arm and a young woman in shorts, both of them holding weapons, and a little girl in a pink vest that was much too big for her. They weren't infected, or at least not showing signs that Rebecca could see, but they looked like hell nonetheless. With their ripped clothes and their faces pale and shocked beneath masses of dirt, they certainly could have passed for the Walking Dead. "I'll talk," David said, his crisp accent mild but firm, and then they were pulling up beside the raccoon survivors. David opened his window and killed the engine, the young cop stepping forward as the woman slipped one grimy arm around the little girl's shoulders. "There's been an accident in Raccoon," he said, and although they were obviously tired and wounded and badly in need of help, there was a wariness in the cop's tone, a guarded, careful note that suggested just how bad things had been. A terrible accident. You don't want to go there. David frowned. "What sort of accident, officer?" The young woman spoke up, her mouth a set in bitter line. "An umbrella accident," she said, and the cop nodded, and the little blonde girl buried her face against the woman's hip. John and Rebecca exchanged a look, and David hit the switch to unlock the doors. "Really? Those tend to be the worst kind," he said gently. "We'd be happy to help you if you'd like, or we could call for help." It was a question. The cop glanced back at the woman, then met David's gaze for several long beats. He must have seen something in David's face that he felt he could trust. He nodded slowly, then motioned for the woman and girl to come forward. "Thanks," he said, the exhaustion finally coming through. If you could give us a ride, that'd be great." David smiled. "Please, get in. John, Rebecca, would you assist?" John grabbed a couple of blankets out of the back as Rebecca reached for her medical kit, careful not to uncover the rifles tucked next to the wheel well. She wondered if they knew how lucky they were to have survived. But another look into those 3 exhausted, shell-shocked faces told her that they probably did. They started talking even before David turned the vehicle around, and in a very short time they discovered they had a lot in common as they drove back the way they'd come, leaving the burning city behind.